Rights groups say Iraqis held captive at the infamous US-run Abu Ghraib prison and other facilities are still waiting to get justice. It's been more than 20 years since the US-led coalition invaded Iraq. Now, Human Rights Watch accuses Washington of failing to provide compensation to Iraqis who were tortured by American forces. Around 100,000 Iraqis were detained between the years of 2003 and 2009. Many say they continue to suffer from the long-term effects of that torture. American guards were seen simulating acts of sexual abuse on naked inmates. Cases of beatings and prolonged sleep and sensory deprivation were also documented. After an international outcry, 11 US soldiers were convicted of being involved in abuses at Abu Ghraib. But most American service members who were accused of carrying out the acts of torture were reprimanded without being charged. Human Rights Watch tracked down a torture survivor. This is Taleb Al Majli's story, detailing the physical and mental suffering he still struggles with to this day.
لحد الآن والله يعني أنا مرات منعيد شريط بذاكرتي وأتذكر قلت لك يعني توصل بي مرحلة انتحار والله يعني توصل بي مرحلة انتحار بس أنا ما أقدر يعني أنا عندي هذا ابني بيه سكر يعني منو إليه ما حد إليه أمه راحت تزوجت زين منو إليه وذاك أخوه حالة نفسية يعني هذا السبب اللي يمنعني إلا أنا من زمان مطفي حياتي ومنتهي بال31/10/2003 صار يعني الاعتقال مالي خلوا غطاء براسي وسير كيبل مو جامع حديد لا سير كيبل شريط بلاستيك بصعدني بهمر ودوني سجن ابو غريب اسئله وخذوا تصوير للعين وللطبع اصابع وبعد ما سؤال وجواب ومال نزع ملابسنا والاستهزاء بينا يعني معصوبين العين الاكياس بروسنا لا حول ولا قوه يعني بكم يعني سجين فوق سجين مأساة 1 و4 أشهر.
Taleb's mental and physical health deteriorated in Abu Ghraib. He started to self-harm by biting his hands and arms.
يعني هاي صار 20 سنة راح يصير 20 سنة 2003 لحد الآن وهاي آثارها موجودة ولحد الآن. ضافن حاول يعني أجبر نفسي أنساها وهاي ما أقدر أنساها بقيت وياها متلازمة وهاي يعني أنا صار 20 سنة ما لابس قميص نص ردان ما ألبس يعني هاي حتى مرات مثل بالسيارة من يشوفونها أقول لهم حرق هذا حرق.
Sarah Sanbar is an Iraqi researcher at Human Rights Watch who tracked the survivor that we just listened to. We spoke to her a little earlier and she says some steps have to be taken by the US government for meaningful accountability.
The US did take some steps to prosecute mostly low-ranking soldiers after the abuses were committed. But unfortunately, we didn't see any officers held accountable under the doctrine of command responsibility, which is something that the US has failed to do. And unfortunately, we also haven't seen prosecutions of perpetrators coupled with redress to their victims. We're calling on the US government to do 3 main things. The first is that it needs to review all allegations of abuse and investigate cases based on transparent criteria. Second, it needs to initiate prosecutions against anyone found to be involved, regardless of their rank or position. And finally, it needs to open a pathway where survivors can come forward and make a claim to have their case heard by the US government to receive compensation, apologies, and other forms of redress.
Well, we can speak now to Hoda Abdul Hamid, who joins us now live here in the studio. Hoda, you were in Iraq reporting on the war in the early 2000s. Was it common knowledge what was going on in Abu Ghraib?
Well, there was knowledge that torture was going on in Abu Ghraib, that detainees were randomly captured, held without charge, mistreated. But I don't think anyone expected that what was happening. When those pictures came out, I remember it was like a shockwave. I was in Baghdad at the time. It was a shockwave already among us in our little workspace. And then anyone you'd speak to would say, we could not believe that that was happening, because it was extremely humiliating. And even more so when you are in Iraq and you know about the culture and you know about certain sensitivities, and people would tell you that that was specifically done really to humiliate the prisoner to the core. And I think it was also the last straw. After that, the US probably lost all support. It still had some. Some people believed that, you know, things could get better, getting rid of Saddam Hussein, changing regime and all of that. But I think after those pictures came out and the shockwave it really provoked around the country, the US lost all support.
We're just showing some of those pictures now. They're still so devastating to look at all these years on. I mean, you spoke to American soldiers as well as senior military commanders about what happened. What was their response?
Well, when the scandal broke, the Bush administration was trying to sell it as the making of a few bad apples. Well, we then spoke to some soldiers after they left Iraq. We also spoke to some senior officers of the US Army, and they denied that. They said it was actually systematic. They said that there was a general in charge, Jeffrey Miller. He had been the general in charge in Guantanamo, and then he had been moved to Iraq. And the first thing he said when he arrived is that those prisoners were treated too well, and they had to be treated much worse to get any kind of confession out of them. Because remember, at the time, outside of the prison, there was what the US were calling an insurgency that was picking up momentum day by day. The Iraqi call it resistance, but the US was trying to figure out what was going on. It was at a loss. It was an election year back in the US. George Bush really needed to have nice pictures, nice stories coming out of Iraq. And then this Abu Ghraib scandal comes out and completely backlashes. It actually has the complete opposite effect. If the idea was to torture prisoners to get some kind of confession and to get things back on track, well, that did not happen. All it did is that the resistance picked up momentum. Groups like Al-Qaeda picked up momentum. The Islamic State, which was right there at the beginning with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, picked up momentum. And, you know, and these people we spoke to told us it was orders. And actually, you have declassified documents that show that the defense, Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense at the time in the US, had actually also sanctioned this kind of interrogation technique. They call it enhanced interrogation techniques. But those pictures show that there was no interrogation whatsoever going on at that time. It was simply really about humiliating these prisoners, many of whom left and were released without any charge. And that is something we have to remember.
It's a good point. This was 20 years ago, and yet here we are, so many years later. Why has it been so difficult for victims to get justice?
Well, I think it's just because it's going to open a can of worms. Because once those who were held in Abu Ghraib start getting compensation, then you'll have those who were held in Guantanamo Bay who are going to ask for the same thing. You have those who were part of the rendition programs whereby prisoners were flown to a third country with someone from the CIA with them on military planes to be tortured in that third country to get confessions out of them. So I think once you start this compensation, you probably will have hundreds of people behind that asking for the same thing. And probably that's why the US is reluctant about opening that door.
OK. Hoda, Abdel, Hamid here for us in Doha. Thank you.